All right, so in this first lecture, I'm going to cover an introduction to the scientific method and how the scientific process is important to research in psychological sciences, and introduction to the language of statistics. This will be broken up into the two corresponding parts. So in this video, I'll be beginning with science and research. So, in terms of the ways we can interact with scientific research, there's different roles that we can play in terms of what research is in our life. Some people are research producers. You put together, you create the research, and you transmit the findings of that research to an audience. Likely in this class, this is going to be your first experience as actually producing research. You'll be doing a research study from the ground up, basically from idea, inception, all the way to analysis and presentation. Now, some of you after this experience might not go on to do any more research production in your life. Not everyone goes on to do a career or to further study any area that necessitates production of original scientific research. Now, even if you never go on to produce any more research in your life, you will inevitably continue to be a research consumer. So, given that research is something that is transmitted out into the world, it's communicated from the producers to a wider audience. A lot of the times, we're bombarded with research for our consumption. So, whether or not you read original research articles in an academic journal or you just hear about some hot new research on the evening news or on the internet, we are constantly bombarded with research. I think it's important to understand these two roles because we will inevitably be research consumers, and the best way to be a well informed consumer is to understand that production process. So, I'm going to cover what it means to be a producer and a consumer because you will, at least through the duration of this class, inhabit both roles. So the production of research hinges on the scientific method and using a good, solid scientific approach for your inquiry. In terms of what goes into the scientific approach, one of the first steps is to make sure that your work is systematic and empirical. What this means is that your scientific inquiry should be grounded in observations of what you see happening in the laboratory or in the natural world. That's what empiricism means. That means grounded in observations. Systematic refers to the fact that you don't want to ground your findings in a single instance that you observe because it might be a fluke or it might not give you the full story. Systematic refers to taking those observations and collecting data in a systematic, iterative way, meaning you're going to continue taking observations in a way to try and flesh out what appears to be true. So you want to base your findings on observations over several different time periods. Science should be the realm of empirically solvable problems. There are certain things that we can't know through the scientific approach, things like the nature of morality, whether or not there's an afterlife, whether or not humans have souls. Those are things that we can't quite tackle using empiricism. So for something to be empirically solvable, it needs to be something that we can collect data on using our pre-existing measurement techniques. So, for example, if you're interested in cellular biology, something like the microscope is what makes that an empirically solvable problem. If you're talking about psychology, this can be a little bit tricky because if we're talking about psychological phenomena, are these things that we can empirically study? So, a lot of times, for scientific research, this is going to hinge on, for example, self-report, if we're talking certain areas of psychology. Maybe it's going to involve brain imaging. Maybe it's going to involve diagnoses of certain observable symptoms. There are ways to take the variables you're interested in and use available techniques to study them. The scientific research should be publicly verifiable, meaning that other eyes are going to see the results of your study. Maybe there's a collaborative team that puts together the research, then the research is put out into the world via publication. Then non-scientific audiences can also verify the veracity of your scientific claims. Basically, no one should ever take a scientific claim for granted without being able to look over the evidence with your own eyes. Additionally, scientific research should be something that is falsifiable. Again, these need to be research findings that are subject to empirical criticism. So you should have your scientific research hinge on the process of the theory data cycle whereby your ideas could be disproven. It needs to be the case that any claims that you believe are true, you would need to be willing to accept evidence that contradicts what you believe to be true and incorporate that into your knowledge and understanding. So all of these things make the ideal scientific approach. Now, science as an approach for gaining knowledge, obviously this is a little bit harder and more time intensive than merely relying on your gut instincts, for example. So doing science well is really hard. Really, any of these could fail to happen. Scientific research that doesn't get published, right? That would not be publicly verifiable. Scientific research that hinges on a single study or data collection, that would not be systematic. Any of these could fail to happen, and it doesn't negate the worth of the research. It just sort of digs into the credibility in a way that deserves further scrutiny. Now, statistics belongs in this process and is a very key part of the process of conducting psychological science. Statistics are how we try and ensure that we're not making hasty or unfounded claims. It ensures that doing psychological scientific research hinges on letting the data speak for itself by not just sort of eyeballing it and making a conclusion. We want to crunch the numbers and see whether or not we have numerical evidence that our claims are true. So now I'm going to talk more about this distinction between research consumption and research production. I'm going to start with research consumption because, like I said, this is a role that we're all going to inhabit, presumably throughout the course of our lifetime, even if we don't go on to produce more research ourselves. So you might be thinking to yourself, why do I really need training to be a research consumer? I've heard about research. I come to my own conclusions, and I think I'm a pretty smart person, and I think that I can sort of tell what's junk from what's not. I think the evidence is pretty clear that the average non-trained scientist can't really tell the garbage science from the non-garbage science. We're so subject to our psychological biases and heuristics that it's really hard for us to tell what's good from what's bad. We have certain failures to see things that are there, and we sort of see connections where there aren't any. So, big examples of how these biases impinge on our ability to be a good research consumer. For example, in an instance linked in this article that I have here, there was research that came out a couple years ago that linked the usage of a cell phone with brain cancer. And everyone freaked out and thought, well, we shouldn't be using cell phones. It's going to give us brain cancer. That one single research study, it really hasn't been replicated. And all indications are that there is no real link between cell phones and brain cancer. But that research finding was so scary that a lot of people jumped the gun and they didn't evaluate the strength of the science on its face. So we're really subject to a bias whereby our fears and anxieties will greatly sway what we believe to be true, and it keeps us from evaluating the evidence on its strength. Another major example of how failures of scientific literacy have been the results or have led to some pretty severe societal consequences would be the anti-vaccination movement that I'm guessing most of you are familiar with. The anti-vax movement, their entire ethos is basically undermining the legitimacy and value of vaccines, with a particular emphasis on the vaccines that kids receive early in life to protect them against measles, mumps, and rubella. Now, if you're familiar with the anti-vax movement at all, one of the basic principles that the anti-vax movement hinges on is that vaccines are responsible for autism. Now, here's where the anti-vax movement can illustrate this seeing connections where there aren't any. Anti-vaxxers propose that given that autism symptoms seem to develop at around the same age where vaccines are administered, they use that as evidence that vaccines cause autism. Now, that's seeing a connection where there isn't any. Vaccines and the onset of autism symptoms happen to occur at the same developmental step. That is the age where it's safe to give kids vaccines. It's also the age when kids start to talk, so you can finally start to see autism's symptoms present themselves. But Critically, and this is a theme we'll constantly revisit, correlation is not causation. Just because those two things happen at similar developmental stages doesn't mean that one is causing the other. So people are seeing a connection where there isn't any because all of these anxieties about children with autism are driving people to try and find an explanation or a cause when the evidence is just not there. Vaccines are perfectly safe and do not cause autism. The research is clear, but it's all these biases, for example, of the confirmation bias, where if you believe something to be true, you sort of selectively tune out the information that contradicts you. Additionally, in the anti vax movement, you see a failure to see the connections that are there. So we sometimes overlook really critical information because it maybe doesn't stand out to us. Another tenet of the anti vax movement is that certain illnesses that we're vaccinated against are just normal childhood illnesses. They're perfectly fine. Children grow through them. They don't die. It's just the sort of experience you need to get through. And they fail to see that part of the reason we're not so scared of certain childhood illnesses is because we've eradicated them because of vaccines, right? We're not particularly worried about getting polio because a vaccine eradicated it. They're failing to see how the world we live in is inherently the result of certain vaccines. And I think at this particular point in time, at the height of this COVID-19 crisis, sort of gives you a window into what a world is like where we don't have a vaccine against some of the most terrifying illnesses. So the idea that the anti-vax movement says we shouldn't be afraid of these illnesses, they only are able to see that. They only are able to say that because vaccines have made these diseases not something that we're necessarily so terrified of day in, day out. If you ever are having a conversation with anti-vaxxer and they try and pull this point out, I've sometimes been asked by students what a good strategy is for dealing with this sort of biased way of thinking. There's a YouTube video that you can look up of an infant with whooping cough tugging on those emotional heartstrings, because that video is just so hard to watch. It's so terribly sad watching this baby struggle to breathe. Pulling on those emotional heartstrings are going to do a lot better to counteract these biases than trying to hit people with the science and research. And all of this is to say that basically humans at baseline, before scientific training, no, we're not good consumers of research. We do need training to do this well, because failures to train people on scientific literacy so they can be well-informed consumers of research can lead to some pretty crappy societal consequences, such as the anti-vax movement. So I would argue basically that yes, we do need training to be a research consumer. Even if you don't go on to produce research ever again, I do think we need training. What are the benefits to being a well-informed consumer of research? Well, if you're able to wade through the absolute mountain of research that we're inundated with day in, day out on the news, on the internet, from our friends and families, telling good from bad research has a host of benefits for you. You're able to pursue your own health and well-being a little bit better, right? If you know which issues you should be paying attention to and which are just sort of junk research, you're better able to pursue your own health and well-being. Maybe spending your money more wisely. These 2 points go hand in hand, right? We are bombarded with a lot of really crappy nutritional research constantly. What's the new fad diet? What's the fad new way to try and lose weight? The research on nutrition and weight loss is pretty clear that there is no fad diet that works. The only thing that seems to help somewhat with long-term weight loss is going to be limiting caloric intake and exercising regularly. There is no fad diet, no extreme elimination diet that seems to really work long term. The research is clear that you might short term lose some weight, but very consistently the weight comes back. So if you want to pursue your own health and feed yourself well and not waste your money on garbage diets, it pays to be a good consumer of this area of research. Additionally, if you want to advocate for the issues that you really care about, like I just talked about with the anti-vax movement, I think it's really important that the scientific literacy that we can encourage in people can help counteract some pretty nefarious forces in our culture, like the anti-vax movement. If you can tell that the anti-vax movement is predicated on bad science, I think you can be an advocate for issues that are really important and can really help with people's health and well-being. So being able to advocate for issues you care about, maybe being able to effectively convince the people around you or even yourself that you should get that vaccine that you've been putting off. And falling prey to bad research, yes, it can result in you maybe wasting money on a stupid fad diet, but it can even go beyond that. There are individuals out there who really prey on scientific illiteracy to even try and separate dying individuals from the last of their money. So people peddling quack cancer cures with essential oils or whatever it may be. There are people out there, and you can even see that the US Public Health Service has had to issue PSAs to try and help people avoid this, right? Being someone who can't tell good from bad research might eventually result in some pretty awful consequences if, say, you're encountering someone who's trying to prey on desperation. So I think the benefits of being a good, well-informed research consumer range from just being able to spend your money wisely to not falling prey to people who are really trying to not falling prey to people who are trying to prey on your desperation. And now this is fun. I think that in trying to highlight just how important it is to really do your own deep dive on scientific issues to come to your own conclusion, I wanted to highlight a series of somewhat controversial topics on this same realm of kind of nutrition, because this is a research area that is just rife with tomfoolery and garbage. And so I wanted to highlight a few interesting topics from this realm that, to me, sort of highlight this need to do your own research and to be really well informed. So, you might be familiar with research on the health benefits of red wine. You might have heard that a glass of red wine at night with dinner is good for your heart health. So I've linked here, and all of these points, I've got links here so you can read further. You might be thinking to yourself, yeah, I've heard research that red wine is good, but then I've heard research that any drinking is bad for you, and drinking even a couple drinks a week shortens your lifespan by quite a bit. If you're thinking that this is confusing and that the research is constantly flip-flopping back and forth, you are absolutely right. So if you're trying to come to a conclusion of whether or not you should have a drink, it's really important to take that research for what it is, which is a lot of self-contradicting nonsense. There really is no good solid consensus that a glass of wine is great for you or that alcohol is bad for you. What this basically leaves us with is that you have to just do whatever makes you happy. If the research is inconclusive, really, it probably doesn't do any good to worry about it and constantly try and follow the research. In my own reading, the research flip-flops and it's so inconsistent that what I'm left with is basically, I want to do whatever makes me happy, and I'm not going to trip too hard on what all of this constantly inconsistent back and forth research shows, because that tells me that the quality of the research itself, I kind of can't trust it. I can't take it necessarily on its face. I want to take it with a grain of salt, and that's a perfectly fair conclusion to come to. This is a fun one. I don't know if you are familiar with this concept of oil pulling. This is a phenomenon that gains some traction in certain alternative medicine scenes. So this is based on some old Indian medicine where basically if you swish oil in your mouth for like a really long time, I'm talking like 20 minutes, it can be coconut oil, it can be other oils, basically it draws toxins out of your body, and it's great for, the claims say, all manner of health outcomes. So pulling toxins out that can help your dental health, that can help your heart health, that can help inflammation. Just sold that this is basically a panacea where if you swish coconut oil in your mouth constantly, you're going to solve all your health problems. Now, what I've linked there basically indicates that there is only one empirical scientific study that has found any positive outcome for oil pulling. Basically, there's one research study that found that oil pulling caused diminished levels of a single bacteria in the mouth that tends to be associated with cavities. You might be thinking to yourself, that doesn't sound very convincing, and you're right. I would say on the strength of the research, there's no solid consensus that oil pulling is going to be great for your health. Now, on the other hand, you might be thinking to yourself, what's the harm? right? Besides wasting money on coconut oil that you could have used for something else. Yeah, the point here is that you can kind of just come to your own conclusion of what you think is worth your money, again, based on the strength of the research. If you say to yourself, well, that one study is convincing enough to me and there's sort of no downside, yeah, it's perfectly fine to do that. You have to sort of weigh your own priorities. And if you say to yourself, no, a single study doesn't convince me, well, that just tells you that's not something you have to waste your time or money on. This is a personal favorite. There's a actual quite solid mountain of scientific research indicating that chocolate is quote unquote a superfood and has all kinds of health benefits associated with it. Again, I've linked there just a smattering, and actually in the next few slides, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper onto this issue. But out of any of these topics that I'm talking about on this slide, the most consistent evidence is that chocolate actually does have potentially some health benefits, which is great. You might be thinking to yourself, fantastic, I love chocolate. I would love to feel better about eating chocolate. Despite the fact that this is the most compelling area of these points that I'm raising now, it is still important to dive a little bit deeper. So we're going to do that in the subsequent slides. But then a last very interesting one that I'd like to highlight right now is the research on the stigmatization of food containing fat. Now, you guys might be too young to remember when the big food fad was fat-free this, low-fat that. Now it's all sort of healthy fats and low carb, etc. But this was a cultural phenomenon for years that fat needed to be eliminated from our diets because that was going to solve all our health problems, that was going to help everyone lose weight. This highlights a slightly different implication of the quote unquote doing your own research and looking into things a little bit deeper phenomenon that I think is so important. There actually was a fair amount of pretty credible research coming out around the 80s through the 70s and the 80s that found that sugar actually was perfectly fine. And you might be thinking that that sounds a little bit crazy. And you're right. A bunch of research that actually came out of Harvard was found to actually have funding from titans in the sugar industry, including Coca-Cola. The sugar industry was paying scientists to downplay the link between sugar and certain health outcomes and shift the blame to fat in foods. And that kicked off, again, like I said, years and years of entire food industries dedicated to low-fat, no-fat food products and fad diets. This highlights that it's important to look a little bit deeper at research that on its face might seem compelling or credible. Not to be a conspiracy theorist, because it's not. You just have to look at what's the motivation of research and who's paying for it, because sometimes you will uncover things that might make you think twice about trusting research. Again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't trust scientists or you shouldn't trust doctors. It's just that you owe it to yourself to dive a little bit deeper and always think about what's the motivation of who is putting out the research, because you might discover something surprising. Now, like I said, out of those 4 topics I just discussed, chocolate has the most compelling body of research indicating that there might be something there, that chocolate might actually have something to it in terms of health protection. In the article I linked on the previous slide, there was a references section. Now, a references section that cites original scientific research, that is a good sign. So when I read the article I linked on the previous page, I thought to myself, this actually looks quite compelling. Look at all these great references from scientific journals. Any of these articles would have been peer-reviewed, and they're all in different journals, indicating that different scientists were producing this in different academic journals with different perspectives. And all of these references basically indicate that these various scientists found a positive relationship between chocolate and positive health outcomes, and that's great. Now, just for fun, I want to highlight that it's still important, even though this looks good to me, to still dive even deeper and take a look at the articles themselves so you can be putting a really careful eye on just what it is these research articles can tell us. So, for example, let's just take this one. These researchers published an article entitled Cocoa Intake, Blood Pressure, and Cardiovascular Mortality, the Zutphen Elderly Study. Sounds pretty good, right? Cocoa intake, blood pressure, and cardiovascular mortality. That on its face sounds like they found that eating chocolate had positive implications for blood pressure and cardiovascular mortality. That is to say, maybe chocolate lowered blood pressure and lessened the likelihood of dying from heart disease. That's what cardiovascular mortality is. So this looks great, right? If chocolate actually did those things, that would be fantastic. I would caution you, though, to even look deeper than this because article titles can be misleading. So I went to take a look at this particular article, and here's what I found. Okay, the article itself, in the methods just in the abstract stated, habitual food consumption was assessed by cross-checking dietary history method in 1985, 1990, and 1995. Cocoa intake was estimated from the consumption of cocoa-containing foods. Well, here's one thing that tells me. They were basically using self-report to assess chocolate intake. That is not a bad strategy, but it's certainly imperfect. Maybe people aren't perfectly remembering how much chocolate they ate when. So already you say to yourself, well, even if we can assume that people were being accurate, what else might be going on here? Okay. All right, so at the final data collection period, 314 men died, 152 of cardiovascular diseases. Compared to the lowest tertile of cocoa intake, the adjusted relative risk for men in the highest tertile was blah, blah, blah numbers, cardiovascular mortality, and all-cause mortality. Essentially, what that tells me is that they divided the men in this cohort up into 3 groups of low, medium, and high chocolate consumers. And they found that those in the high chocolate consumer group tended to die less from heart disease. Okay, again, that sounds great, but you might be thinking to yourself, that doesn't sound like the best way of putting people into groups of just low, medium, and high. Again, that maybe seems a little bit imperfect. So then the conclusion is that in a cohort of elderly men, cocoa intake is inversely associated with blood pressure and 15-year cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. Okay, that sounds great. Another thing to point out, in a cohort of elderly men, this data was collected on elderly German men throughout the 80s and 90s. And you might be thinking to yourself, I'm not an elderly German man, and I might be quite different from elderly German men. Does this finding generalize to me? Again, fair question. It's a limitation. And then finally, a sort of a macro point that I'll make. Cocoa intake was inversely associated with blood pressure. Here's where you want to make sure that you're not falling prey to the same correlation not equaling causation trap. The finding from this study was that cocoa intake is inversely associated with blood pressure and dying of heart disease. Right? Look at the language, inversely associated. That's correlational language. Anyone who takes this research and they say, look, chocolate improved health, you can't quite make such bold claim on the strength of this research. The chocolate intake was associated with health. That could mean that the chocolate caused the positive health outcomes, or maybe there's something else. What always stands out to me is thinking about what else might be associated with being someone who eats a lot of chocolate. Maybe those people work out more. Maybe people who treat themselves to chocolate work out more, and that's what actually causes the positive health outcomes. We can't rule that out. Another idea I had is maybe people who eat chocolate are happier because treating yourself makes you happy. And maybe not being so rigid and uptight about your diet and being a happier person, maybe that's associated with positive health outcomes. Again, we can't know. The explanation that the chocolate caused the improved health outcomes, yes, it's a possibility, but you can't make such a bold claim on the strength of this inherently correlational research. So I would caution you, in just reading an article title and assuming that you know what it says, just breaking down the information available in the abstract, never mind the entire article, demonstrates that there are imperfections to this research in terms of being able to make the most bold causal claim. And notice that the researchers themselves don't make that stronger causal language. They're not saying chocolate caused the positive health outcomes. They make sure to hedge a little bit because, again, the strength of this evidence is not that it demonstrates that chocolate caused positive health outcomes. So you wouldn't want to read this article and assume that you can go binge on chocolate. If you want to take it there because you love chocolate, feel free. But that's not really what exactly the research is able to help us conclude. Okay, so all of that was to show you sort of all of the importance of being a good research consumer and the sort of depth of the work you have to do to really do it well. It's harder than it looks. And on the topic of being harder than it looks, let's now talk a little bit about what the process of research production involves. Okay? Producing scientific research involves quite a bit of heavy lifting and a lot of work to do it well. I've already mentioned this systematic empiricism bit that again goes to say that scientific research should be the result of many observations and collections of data. But now I want to talk a little bit more about what we call the theory data cycle. This is basically the process of how science moves forward. It's a constant cyclical process that, when done well, follows a certain series of steps. So I'm going to talk more about that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this publicly verifiable bit. So how does that really look? In the context of the ecosystem of scientific work, this is going to look like getting your research published. So I want to talk through a little bit what that looks like. Okay, it's important in understanding what scientific production looks like to think a little bit more deeply about what the idea of a scientific theory is. So a theory is going to be any well-confirmed, subject to confirmation, explanation of a phenomenon in the natural world that came about via the process of the scientific method, again, systematic empiricism. Notice that I say it should be well confirmed. A theory should not come out of thin air. It should be something that it's possible to empirically support or contradict. Your theory should be an explanation for why something is happening that you can collect data to try and support. It also needs to be an explanation whereby if you collect data that contradicts you, you amend the theory. You let the data speak for itself. A theory should not come out of thin air. Sometimes scientific research does move forward based on your so-called light bulb moments where you sort of have a dash of creativity and you think of an explanation. But really, even the ideas that seem to come about from a light bulb moment should come from solid background research. So figure out whether or not there have already been developed theories that have support for them to help develop your ideas. And additionally, it should be based on things that you observe. Okay, again, maybe you observe a phenomenon in the natural world and an explanation that makes sense comes to you in sort of a moment of creative thinking. But again, it shouldn't necessarily just come out of thin air. It should be based on something that you observe or some background research that you do. It's really important to know that the term theory should not be understood as a dismissive. In, for example, the anti-evolution movement, basically people that don't believe in the theory of evolution, the term theory has been used to try and contradict the veracity of the theory of evolution. The idea of something being just a theory comes from the idea that a theory is never actually 100% proven. Okay? Theories can be supported or contradicted, but any scientist worth their salt, if they have a solid body of evidence confirming their theory, they're going to stay away from black and white language like something proves something else or that something is 100% certain. There is no such thing as 100% certainty when you're talking about scientific research because science is done systematically. It really never stops. So even something as well supported as the effectiveness of vaccines, or something as well supported as the theory of evolution, which is very well supportive. The research is very solid and very consistent. Scientists tend to stay away from such and such is 100% certain or proven. Because since this process is cyclical and never stops, a good scientist will never rule out that some new evidence might emerge that contradicts what we believe to be true, right? Science should not be set in stone. It is continuous, and that's why a theory should not be spoken about as being proven 100%. We should talk about it being supported or contradicted. This is not to say that theories cannot be well supported or that something is quote unquote just a theory as a way to dismiss it. Certain theories are very, very well studied and have a lot of support for them. Okay, so I want to give you an example of how theory production works in scientific research. This is the basic cycle that defines the theory to data cycle that science does. And this is why the development of a theory is not something that comes out of thin air or is dismissive. Whenever a scientist has a theory, they don't stop there. They develop research questions that help them assess the strength of the support for their theory. So, what they do is they break off a specific question that helps assess an implication of the theory in a more specific sort of a way. So, theories are meant to be broad explanations. The research questions and designs are meant to be the specific ways that we test our theories. Once you design your research, you come to the hypothesis stage. We're going to talk more about hypothesis testing later in the semester, but the basic definition of a hypothesis is a prediction. So once you have your broad theoretical explanation, you develop a design to help you test the question, and you make a prediction of what you're going to find. From there, you collect the data, you run your analyses, and you figure out whether or not the data, the numbers, the observations support your theory. If so, great. You can then test another research question. You can develop a new hypothesis, and you can do the process over and over again. Only after this process has happened many times does the scientific community start to accept that a theory appears to be legitimate. Now, sometimes, a lot of the times, a scientist will come up with a hypothesis and the data won't support what you predicted. This is really common. It's disappointing. A good scientist will dust themselves off, say that looks like I was wrong. I need to revise my explanation. I need to revise my understanding. Once I tweak my theory, I start over and I test a new question design and develop a new prediction. So, this is what I mean by a cyclical process, and this is why a theory is, again, not a dismissive term and it's not the same thing as speculation. A theory is meant to be something that can be confirmed or contradicted. Now, a really classic example of how the theory data cycle has worked in one area of developmental psychology is the quote contact comfort hypothesis developed by Harry Harlow. Okay, so again, this is meant to be an example of how the theory data cycle can work. If you're familiar with the contact comfort hypothesis, basically the theory behind the contact comfort hypothesis is that part of the reason why infants of many mammalian species cling to their caregiver is for comfort, right? One idea is that infants cling to their caregiver just to get food. Another idea is that there's something inherently important about close contact cuddling, basically. That it's important to just have physical contact even beyond the administration of food and nutrition. So, Harry Harlow's basic theory was that part of what drives this cuddling behavior is just a desire for close cuddly contact. So, here's what he did to try and test his theory. Basically, using these small monkeys, I always forget what kind of monkey it is. I look this up like every couple months and I forget every single time. Rhesus macaques, I think? Maybe? Comment down below. Were they rhesus macaques? I would love to know. Okay, so he developed a research design that let him test whether or not the cuddling behavior was all about getting food or if it was more so about cuddling. So here's what he did. He set up these infant monkeys with two fake monkey moms. One was the cold, uncomfy monkey mom you see to the left. That was the monkey that had the bottle of food. Not particularly nice to cuddle with, though. On the right, you see the cuddly monkey mom. She was covered with a nice soft cloth that was fun to cuddle with. The idea is, what would Harry Harlow's prediction be if his theory about contact being important above and beyond nutrition, what would his hypothesis be? He predicted that if his explanation was true, the monkey would want to spend its time with the cuddly cloth monkey mom. He collected the data, and what he found was confirmation for his theory. He found that the baby monkeys spent basically all day with the cuddly cloth monkey mom. They would go to the wire monkey mom when hungry to get food, but they'd go immediately right back to cuddling. This is empirical support for his theory. When the monkeys spend all of their time with the cloth monkey mom, it refutes the alternative explanation that the cuddling behavior is all about getting food. If that was the case, the monkeys would have spent all of their time with the wire mom, and they didn't. What he found was support for his contact comfort theory, indicating that part of this behavior is because of this desire for close comfort. So this basically walks you through the steps of your theory to your research questions to your design to your hypothesis to data. How does this demonstrate this cyclical process of going back again? It's important to note that this one particular study that Harry Harlow did, the classic monkey study, does not 100% prove that his theory was true. It's support for his theory, but he wouldn't be done there. You would want to replicate this study and try a different sort of a research question where you could test the implication of your theory in a slightly different way. For example, maybe you'd want to replicate this theory with human infants. You'd probably have to tweak the design a little bit. But if you want solid support for the theory, this is what you have to do. You can't just take one particular hypothesis and collection of data and say that you're done and you've proved your theory. The theory needs more support, and that's why the process is cyclical. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the publication process. The science is basically going through this cyclical theory data cycle process, but how does the data that's collected get out into the world? Typically, this is going to be done through the process of getting your research published in an academic journal. This is typically the first way that scientific research is filtered out towards the public. So when I say the publication process, this is basically writing up your research findings and submitting them for consideration for publication at any given journal article. There's so many academic journals out there on all different areas. Even within the field of psychology, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of journals. If, let's say, you're a social psychologist, you're probably hoping to get your research published in JPSP someday. That's that one at the top right. This is the highest regarded social psychology journal that we have. So it's really hard to get published in. You need to have some really good, compelling, and novel research to get published in there. But there's other journals for social psychology that are maybe not as hard to get published in, or maybe have a more niche or specific area that they like to publish on, something maybe more specific than social psychology. So if you're a social psychologist, even just within that realm, you have tons to choose from. There's developmental psych articles, there's neuroscience articles, there's cognitive neuroscience articles, or journals rather, sorry. Part of this process is figuring out what journal your particular manuscript, your particular research might be a good fit for. And journals range from easy-ish to get into to very, very difficult to get into. So for example, JPSP, over 90% of the manuscripts submitted there get rejected. Something like Science or Nature, these are interdisciplinary scientific journals, that's even harder. So when I say get rejected or get accepted, I want to talk a little bit more about what that means. This publication process basically has the scientist going through a series of steps that constitute what we call the peer review process. So any academic journal has a team of editors working together who receive and initially review the manuscripts. The journal editor might read your manuscript and say this is garbage and there's no hope for it, and they might desk reject it, is what it's called. From there, you'd be free to take your manuscript to another journal for consideration, maybe edit it a little bit before resubmitting it, but basically that means your journey at that particular journal is done. If the editor deems your manuscript may be worth another shot, they're going to send it out for peer review. This is basically when the editor reaches out to experts in the field that are not affiliated with you, the author, and they ask them to give their feedback on the article. The peer reviewers can say that they don't think the manuscript will ever be in the shape to be published at that journal, and they might reject it. They might indicate that the publication would be of an appropriate caliber to be accepted given some revisions, so a revise and resubmit option. That happens quite frequently. And then ultimately they might say that they think it should be accepted. Basically, any publication that has ever been accepted at least went through a few rounds of revise and resubmit before ultimately getting accepted. It's very, very rare to get accepted right out the gate. Okay, so these are your basic three options. This is all a process whereby other individuals are going to be able to take a look at your research and evaluate the quality of it. They can evaluate your methods, they can evaluate your theoretical explanations, they can evaluate whether you need to have more citations in your literature review, they can evaluate whether or not they don't like your grammar or formatting. They can basically give any feedback that they want to. This entire system is meant to make it so that only the best quality science gets published in the top tier journals. It's also designed to make sure that other sets of eyes see your research before it ends up getting out into broader audiences. So, all of this is basically to ensure that the scientific research that gets publicly available has gone through some rigorous scrutiny. Okay, so that's basically the hellish landscape that exists for someone who is producing research. To wrap up this particular section, I want to talk a little bit about places that you can find research to help inform the research that you either do or the research that you consume. Basically, I think it's important to think about where you're finding research and evaluating strongly where you're coming across the scientific research that you consume. So, YouTube, for example, not maybe the best place to find scientific research. You want to be sort of carefully evaluating where you get your research from. So here are my recommendations. As I did with the chocolate example, why not look up the original articles themselves and you can really evaluate the evidence on its face. Where do you find journal articles? We're going to talk a lot about the PsycInfo library database in an activity next week. This is basically going to be a database where you can find the vast majority of published psychological research. Google Scholar is a function of Google that just selects for academic writing. So, whereas a Google search is going to turn up everything on God's internet, Google Scholar is just going to show you any academic sources. ResearchGate, this is LinkedIn for researchers, where basically if you do research, you can have a profile where you post your own research. So if you see something on ResearchGate, it's likely the scientists themselves posted it. So any of these would be good ways to try and access the original articles themselves. Wikipedia. You might think I'm here to rag on Wikipedia. I'm not. Wikipedia is an excellent resource for getting acquainted with areas of science that you are unfamiliar with. It tends to be easily accessible and written in a way that you can understand, and it tends to be a very generally good introduction to a possibly vast area of research. Obviously, though, I would recommend using Wikipedia with caution. The information on Wikipedia comes from crowdsourcing, so basically anyone can contribute to that. Generally, crowdsourced information tends to be of decent quality, but you don't exactly know where that information is being sourced from. So Wikipedia can definitely contain inaccuracies. Oftentimes they get fixed pretty quickly, but not always. Another thing I'll say about Wikipedia is, as I mentioned earlier, seeing a references section full of original citations is a good sign. Wikipedia has references section on every one of their articles, and that is a good sign. What I would recommend is if you read a Wikipedia article, click down to the references section. Use it as a springboard to try and find other sources. Overall, Wikipedia is a good place to start, but not a great place to end your search for research. Books range from academic and scholarly and of good quality to absolute pop psychology, pop science, smut bullshit. So it's important to understand that just because something is a published book doesn't necessarily make it reputable. If you want to read a book that contains research, just look into the credentials of the author. Ask if the author is someone who's an expert on the area of study. Look and see whether or not there's any citations. All of that would be important to evaluate the effectiveness or just how solid the research is that you're reading. So a great example that I like to mention is Oliver Sacks's books. If you're interested in neuroscience and clinical psychology, Oliver Sacks is, in my opinion, the best writer on those areas written for a mainstream audience. He essentially did write pop psychology books, but they were based on all of his own clinical observations as a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist. So those books, despite the fact that they're fun to read, they are technically pop psychology, they are for mainstream non-scientific audiences, based on the fact that they were written by an expert and it detailed his own firsthand clinical experiences, I would consider those reputable. Online articles, again, it's all about evaluating who they were written by and whether or not you trust their credentials and motivations. So, is the person who's authoring the article someone who you trust, and are they an expert on what they're writing about? For example, the article I linked way at the beginning of this lecture on humans needing training to be good consumers of science, people need training to tell junk science from good science, that was written by a PhD astrophysicist that I follow on Twitter. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, is a PhD astrophysicist an expert on people's ability to use the scientific method and scientific literacy? You can come to your own conclusion. In my opinion, yes. I think a scientist is someone who has enough expertise to write on the topic of scientific literacy, but you're able to make your own assessment. This is basically a process of you want to do your own digging, you want to read as much as you can, you want to try and evaluate the strength of your sources, and you want to come to your own conclusion. Okay, so I've got some discussion points posted for your first discussion of the week. Basically, to get credit for your first discussion, just hop on the discussion board available on Canvas and think through your own idea of a theory data cycle example. Just post your thoughts based on these question prompts and you'll get credit for your first discussion of the week. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video here and pick back up with introducing the language of statistics.